My name is Clara Whitmore, and I'm 67 years old. For most of my adult life, I taught American literature at a community college in Salem, Oregon. I lived in the same house for 35 years. I wore the same kind of soft-soled shoes for the last 20. I was never a headline, never the center of attention, and never the one making the big decisions. I was simply the woman who made sure everyone else got where they needed to go, with clean clothes, hot meals, and someone to remind them they mattered. I was, as my husband Harold once told a colleague at his retirement party, the glue in the quiet spaces. And I believed him. I believed that being dependable would be enough. But nothing prepared me for the day my only son, Miles, stood in our front foyer with his arms crossed and said the words that still echo in my bones. "Mom, you need to leave. This house isn't yours anymore. And honestly, you're nothing but a burden now." It was 2 weeks after Harold passed. The scent of sympathy lilies still clung to the corners of our living room. The casseroles from the neighbors were still in the fridge. I hadn't even moved Harold's things out of the master bedroom. Yet, I'd been sleeping in the guest room, as if that small distance would somehow protect me from fully confronting the truth. But grief moves slowly. Cruelty does not. Miles was calm, almost businesslike. His wife, Ava, was sitting on the staircase behind him, flipping through home renovation catalogs like the place was already hers. She didn't even look up, and maybe that hurt more than the words themselves. I asked quietly, "You want me to move out?" "Now." Miles shrugged. "I inherited everything, Mom. The house, the money, it's all in the will. Ava and I are moving in next week. You've got a few days to pack. I've already reserved you a room at the Mapleview Motor Inn." I stood there, trying to process it. "But we built this place together. This is where you grew up. Where your father—" "That was then," he cut in with the ease of someone deleting an old file. "It's time you found a place more suitable for your age and needs. You'll be better off somewhere with assistance. And frankly, I can't carry your emotional weight on top of everything else." Then he handed me an envelope. Inside, $200 in cash and a folded pamphlet for a senior community that looked more like a storage unit with fake flowers. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't ask him how he could possibly say that to the woman who'd held his hand through fevers and heartbreaks, through spelling tests and broken bones, the woman who'd sewn the lining into his college suit jacket because he hated how it scratched his neck. I just went upstairs, packed 2 suitcases, and stood at the front door one last time. No hugs, no apologies, just the click of the lock behind me. It was raining, not a dramatic downpour, just that slow, persistent drizzle that soaks you through without you even noticing, the kind that makes everything feel heavier, more permanent. I walked to the curb where a rideshare waited, booked by Miles, of course, efficient as always. The driver didn't say a word as I climbed in, just glanced at me in the rearview mirror like he wasn't sure if I was running from something or toward something. When I arrived at the Mapleview, I was given a key card and directed to room 108. The curtains smelled faintly of mildew, and the carpet had a mysterious stiffness to it. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the blank television screen, not bothering to turn it on. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just grieving my husband anymore. I was grieving the illusion that the family I'd given everything to would somehow give a fraction of that back when I needed it. My son had received the house and $85 million from Harold's estate, and the only thing he gave me was a motel room, some pocket cash, and the kind of pity that stings more than it soothes. He thought I'd disappear quietly, that I'd accept his cruelty the same way I'd once accepted his tantrums and his sharp words in adolescence. Patiently, with softness. What he didn't know was that Harold had once told me in the stillness of a Sunday morning, "If anything ever happens to me and things get ugly, go to Langford." Don't question it, Harold had been meticulous about paperwork, paranoid even, and I remember thinking it was a bit dramatic back then. But now, sitting in that dim room, I clung to those words like a lifeline. So the next morning, I put on my coat, smoothed my hair, and walked out the door, not to beg for space in my son's life, but to read the fine print my son clearly hadn't bothered to. 1 week later, I was sitting in Langford and Company, across from Harold's longtime attorney, watching as Miles's face turned pale and his hands started to tremble. Because the will, the real one, was nothing like the summary document Miles had skimmed. "Are you sure?" the lawyer asked, adjusting his glasses. "That you actually read the terms, Miles?" And at that moment, it became clear. He hadn't. He'd assumed. He'd gambled. And now he was about to learn the cost of treating his mother like a disposable footnote in his inheritance story. If you've ever been dismissed, discarded, or made to feel like a footnote in someone else's narrative, know this: you're not alone and you're not powerless. Stick with me, because what came next wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity, one clause at a time. And if this resonates with you, feel free to drop your story in the comments. You never know who needs to hear that they're not the only one. Subscribe for more real stories of silent justice, second chances, and the strength they never saw coming. The motel room was quiet in that unnatural way only cheap places manage, where silence is never peaceful, just empty. Room 108 had a flickering wall sconce above the nightstand and a cracked lampshade that leaned like it had given up trying. The floral bedspread scratched my skin if I shifted too much, and the faint odor of stale detergent clung to the air like regret. But I didn't cry. Not that night. Not even when I opened my small suitcase and saw Harold's cufflinks still in the side pocket, the ones I had meant to drop off at the cleaners before the funeral. He never got to wear them to that board meeting he was so nervous about. He never got to come home. I sat by the lamp, its yellow glow pooling across the table like a fading sunset, and reached for my old wallet. The leather had cracked at the edges. It had been years since I cleaned out the inner folds. I don't even know what I was searching for. Maybe something to tether me, something to give me a next step that wasn't just waiting for the days to pass. And then I found it. Tucked behind a pharmacy receipt from 2016 was a faded silver business card, edges curled, text barely legible in the low light, but I recognized the embossed lettering, Langford and Company, estate law, confidentiality, integrity, strategy. I felt my breath catch, not in a dramatic gasp, but in a quiet tightening, like the universe had just reminded me I wasn't entirely alone. Harold's voice echoed in my mind, not in the mystical way, just memory, sharp and clear. "Clara, if anything ever happens to me, don't let anyone rush you. And for heaven's sake, if things get complicated, go to Langford. Do it privately. No one else needs to know." I remember rolling my eyes when he said that months ago. We just returned from visiting Miles and Ava. It had been a strained dinner, as most of them were. Miles was distracted. Ava was cold. Harold had been quiet the whole ride home until we pulled into the driveway. "They love us in their own way," I told him, trying to lighten the air. He didn't smile, just looked at me, weary, and said, "They love the version of us that's useful, not the version that's aging." That night, I made chamomile tea and tried to forget the heaviness in his voice. But he was always the planner, the one who dotted every I and made sure the ship was storm-proof. I should have paid closer attention. And now, here I was, displaced, discarded, and sitting in a discount motel room with the one card he made sure I kept. I ran my fingers across the name again, Langford. Something about it gave me an anchor, a direction, a reason to get out of that room the next morning that wasn't driven by shame or fear. I picked up my phone and opened the browser. My thumbs hovered, hesitant, before typing, Langford and Company, Salem, Oregon. It loaded slowly. This motel Wi-Fi had all the energy of a tired snail. But eventually, the website appeared. Same logo, same tone, secure, private, trusted since 1954. It felt like Harold. Everything about it felt like Harold. Then I found the address, downtown, a stone's throw from the courthouse. The page mentioned, specializing in multi-generational estate complexities, confidential consultations available by appointment. I looked at the clock. 10:47 p.m., too late to call, but not too late to decide. I set my phone down, breathed deeply, and whispered aloud to no one. Tomorrow, I will go. Not with anger, not with revenge in mind, just with the quiet determination of a woman who had spent decades being dismissed and finally understood the value of her own instincts. I folded the card gently and slid it into my purse, right next to my checkbook and reading glasses. I didn't need sleep. I needed resolve. Outside the window, rain tapped like a soft metronome on the glass. I listened to it for a long time, letting it lull my scattered thoughts into focus. Miles thought I'd disappear, that I'd slink away into irrelevance. He didn't know that Harold hadn't just left behind a fortune. He'd left a trail of breadcrumbs, legal and deliberate, for me to follow. And so, I would. Downtown Salem had a different rhythm than the outer neighborhoods, a sort of composed hum that made you feel like the city knew more than it let on. I arrived at Langford and Company just before 10, clutching the silver card like it was a map through fog. The building was stately, old brick and dark wood, with frosted windows and a brass plate etched simply. Confidentiality, integrity, strategy. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. A young assistant offered tea. I declined. My heart was already too full of things I couldn't name. Resentment, yes, but also something new. Focus. Then the door opened, and there he was. Mrs. Whitmore, the man said, stepping forward with a calm that only comes from knowing too much. I'm Edward Langford. Please come in. His office was like Harold's den used to be. Warm, meticulous, serious. Books lined the shelves like soldiers. A leather-bound file sat in the center of his desk, untouched but ready. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, gesturing for me to sit. Harold was not only a client, but a man I respected deeply. He was thoughtful, deliberate, and very, very clear about his intentions. I stayed quiet, waiting. Edward didn't rush. He opened the file slowly, as though revealing a confession. Before his passing, your husband met with me multiple times over the past year, he said. He was, how should I put it, concerned. Not just about his health, but about how things might play out after he was gone. I blinked. He never told me he was worried. Because he didn't want you burdened, Langford replied, eyes steady, but he prepared. Harold moved the majority of his holdings, real estate, investments, cash reserves, into a revocable living trust. You, Mrs. Whitmore, are the lifetime income beneficiary I sat up. I don't understand. Miles said the will left everything to him. The house, the accounts, even the lake property. Langford offered a small, measured smile. He read the will. But he never bothered to ask about the trust. They are separate, and the trust supersedes the will in nearly every area of the estate. He lifted a thin document, pages cream-colored and dense with legal language. My name appeared on every page like a quiet signature of my husband's loyalty. In plain terms, he continued, Miles is named successor trustee, but only conditionally. Harold included very specific language. If the trustee is found to have acted in a way that is disrespectful, abusive, or in breach of fiduciary duty toward the income beneficiary, he can be removed. Instantly, I blinked again, trying to process. So, I still own everything? Langford's voice remained calm. You are entitled to live in any property held within the trust. All income from the assets, rents, dividends, interest, is legally yours for the remainder of your life. Miles's role was simply to manage those assets according to Harold's terms. He was never the owner. Not truly. I looked down at my lap, where my hands rested. They weren't shaking. They were steady. Langford leaned in slightly, his tone softening. I understand this may come as a shock. But Harold was methodical. He trusted you to know when to act, and he trusted me to stand beside you when that time came. I thought of the rain hitting the motel window last night, the heavy silence in Miles's voice when he said, "Get lost." The way Ava didn't even look at me as I carried my suitcases out. Harold had seen it coming. "I don't want revenge," I said slowly. "I just want my dignity back." Langford nodded. "Then you'll need to act precisely. Legally." No sudden moves. He slid a form toward me. "This is a petition to remove a trustee due to misconduct. I've already drafted it based on Harold's directives. We'll document Miles's statements, his eviction of you, any threats. We'll move through probate court swiftly, but quietly." I stared at the paper. It didn't scream. It didn't accuse. It just moved the pieces. "He won't see this coming," I murmured. "No," Langford said, "because men like Miles rarely read the fine print. They skim the headlines. They assume, they grab." I picked up the pen but didn't sign yet. One last question hung in the air. "What happens if we do this?" Langford smiled again, this time not kindly, but with assurance. "Miles loses all control. The assets remain in the trust. You continue as the income beneficiary, and we appoint a neutral professional to manage everything. You'll never need to see him again, Mrs. Whitmore." "Not unless you want to?" I nodded. For the first time in days, I felt the ground under my feet again. The weight I carried wasn't gone, but it was no longer mine alone. I looked out the window, past the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Miles was sitting in my house, drinking my coffee, thinking he had won. He hadn't read the right document. The Oregon air had dropped to 43 degrees that morning. I could feel it creeping through the seams of my motel room. The old radiator, wheezing like it too, had lost its purpose. I reached for my wool cardigan, the one Harold gave me on our 30th anniversary, and realized it wasn't there. It was still hanging behind the laundry door, at my house. A simple sweater, beige and worn, but it mattered, maybe more than I let on. So I went back. The driveway felt unfamiliar, as though the gravel had been rearranged in my absence. The porch lights were on, even though it was day. Someone had moved the ceramic wind chimes Harold hung from the beam. They now lay boxed near the trash bin. Inside, the front door was wide open. Tools and dust filled the air. A man in paint-splattered boots was scribbling on a clipboard near the fireplace, and Ava's voice echoed from the kitchen. "We'll knock that wall out. Open concept. Maybe a wine bar over here." She turned and spotted me. Her face barely registered recognition. "Oh, that was all." "I came for a sweater," I said, keeping my tone flat. "In the laundry room." Ava didn't respond. She waved a hand at the contractor as if dismissing a mild irritation. I stepped quietly down the hallway. The house smelled different, sterile, cold, like plaster dust and ambition. My sweater hung exactly where I'd left it, still carrying a faint trace of lavender detergent. As I folded it over my arm, I heard footsteps. Miles. He stood at the hallway's end, arms crossed, face unreadable. "You're trespassing," he said. I stared at him for a long moment, then calmly reached into my purse and pulled out a sealed envelope. "I'm not here to fight. Just to give you this." He took it without looking at the return address. "What is it now?" he scoffed. "A letter from Langford and Company," I replied. "You may want to read it carefully. It outlines the trust structure and a clause you overlooked." Miles ripped it open without ceremony, scanned the first paragraph, then tossed it onto the hallway console. "You let some overpriced lawyer whisper nonsense in your ear, and now you think you've got leverage?" he said, voice rising. "Mom, you were always a sentimental woman. Dad knew that. He gave you a courtesy role. I'm the one he trusted with the future. He didn't trust you," I replied quietly. "He tested you." Miles smirked, stepping closer. You really believe he wanted you managing anything? You? The woman who spent her life picking curtains and baking muffins for church sales? Come on, Mom. That trust was legal padding, symbolic. I'm the executor of this legacy, and you... He paused, eyes narrowing. You're just the last loose thread. For a moment, my fingers clutched the edge of the sweater tighter. You're wrong, Miles, I said. Harold designated me the income beneficiary for life. You're just the trustee, conditional, and I've initiated the process to review your conduct. He laughed. Review away. No one's going to believe I did anything wrong, especially when I let you take your little motel vacation without pressing charges. He leaned in. And just so you know, Ava's recording everything for documentation. She's very thorough. I hope so, I replied. At that moment, a voice cleared behind us. A woman I hadn't seen before standing near the foyer. Late 40s, conservative dress, discreet badge clipped to her belt. Clara Whitmore? She asked, stepping forward. I nodded. Emily Bloom, Department of Adult Protective Services. I received an anonymous request to check on your welfare. I stopped by the motel, but the clerk said you'd come here. Mind if I ask a few questions? Miles froze. Bloom's eyes moved between us, observing everything. The tension, the dust, the unopened letter. I'm just retrieving a personal item, I said. I see, she said. Would you like to make a formal statement regarding any recent changes in your housing situation? I'd prefer to wait, I replied. Some truths need to land at the right time. Miles glanced at her badge again, then looked back at me with a flicker of unease. Bloom opened a small notepad and began jotting quietly. Then I'll document this as a wellness check with observed family tension and transitional housing concerns. No need to elaborate now. She looked at me gently. If that changes, my number is here. She handed me a card, then gave Miles a professional nod and left as quietly as she'd come. I tucked the card into my pocket. I think we're done here, I said, turning toward the door. Miles didn't reply. As I stepped outside, the sweater warmed me more than it should have. Not because of the wool, but because I'd left something else behind. Doubt. That house wasn't home anymore. But the truth? That was coming with me. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. The motel room smelled faintly of mildew and leftover Chinese takeout. I had a headache from the flickering ceiling light, but I left it on. Darkness felt too honest tonight. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, flipping through a notepad where I'd scribbled everything I needed. Soap, toothpaste, a new pair of slippers, maybe some chamomile tea. Little things, nothing fancy. Just dignity in a bag. The next morning, I wrapped my scarf twice around my neck and walked to the nearest pharmacy. I didn't own a car anymore. Miles had asked Ava to handle the old Subaru, and handle meant it disappeared from the driveway without a word. I walked slowly past a dry cleaner, a boarded-up diner, and a bus stop with no bench. It was colder than I expected. The ache in my knees reminded me I hadn't taken my calcium pills in weeks. Inside the pharmacy, I picked up my items with deliberate care. I avoided anything too expensive. No brand names, no extras. I moved toward the register with the practiced frugality of a woman who once couponed every Saturday. The total came to $43.27. I pulled out the silver card. It was still clean, tucked into the third slot of my wallet. Miles's name embossed neatly in capital letters. It was technically a supplemental card, one he'd given me to make things easier after Harold's stroke. We'll just keep all expenses streamlined, Mom, he had said, for efficiency. I handed it over with a faint smile. The clerk ran it. Declined. He tried again. Declined. I'm sorry, he said gently. Do you have another form of payment? I stared at him for a moment. My fingers shook slightly, but not from anger. From something colder, something quiet. No, I said, then added, could I have the receipt, please? for a declined transaction? Yes, please. He printed it and handed it to me. I took the paper in both hands, folded it once, then tucked it into the inside pocket of my coat. Is everything okay? He asked, eyes soft. I nodded. Yes, everything's finally starting to make sense. I stepped out into the wind. My hands were empty, but I felt heavier. Back in the motel room, I placed the receipt under the lamp and stared at it like it was a confession. There it was. A son cutting off his mother's basic access to funds, not out of necessity, but power. A pattern of behavior now formalized on paper. A tool, a trigger, a line crossed. I knew the law didn't need tears, it needed facts. This was a fact. I reached into the drawer beside the bed and pulled out the Langford envelope again. His words echoed in my memory. Clara, you have the right to remove your son as trustee if his actions reflect mismanagement, abuse of power, or emotional exploitation. I'd hesitated before, partly out of love, partly out of habit, but mostly out of fear. Fear that taking control meant becoming someone I didn't recognize. But in that dark room with only the sound of a leaking tap and the chill of a closed heart, I realized something. I wasn't becoming someone else. I was remembering who I used to be before they rewrote me. I took out a pen. Slowly, quietly, I signed the authorization form Langford had prepared. Just one signature. No revenge, no yelling, no threats, just ink. I whispered into the empty room, "Let the law speak for me now." The elevator chimed as it opened to the 9th floor of the Langford and Company building. I walked out with measured steps, gripping the manila folder in my left hand. It held only 3 sheets of paper, but it weighed like a verdict. Langford was already standing when I entered. He offered no pleasantries, only a steady nod. Behind him, the rain tapped gently on the floor-to-ceiling windows. The same rain that had followed me from the house I no longer lived in. "This is the document we discussed," he said. "By signing this, you officially remove Miles Whitmore as trustee and appoint Colton Trust Bank to assume fiduciary duties." I sat across from him. The leather chair was deep and cold, but I didn't shift. I unfolded the pen from the holder, and for a moment I just stared at the dotted line. I wasn't shaking. That surprised me. "You're absolutely sure?" Langford asked, his voice careful but unwavering. I nodded. Yes. I signed my name, Clara Evelyn Whitmore. The signature looped across the page, calm and legible. I didn't pause. I had read every clause. I understood what I was doing. More than that, I understood why. Langford added his counter-signature and sealed the document in a labeled envelope. Then he picked up the phone and said 3 simple words. "Bring him in." I didn't ask who. I already knew. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Miles walked in. No knock, no eye contact. He wore a navy blazer and the same smug expression that used to charm interviewers and board members. Not today. "Mom," he said, his tone clipped. "You dragged me here for what, exactly?" Langford gestured to the folder on the table. "Mr. Whitmore, please review the full version of your late father's trust documents. I believe you may have overlooked some key provisions." Miles scoffed, yanked the folder, and flipped through the pages. At first he skimmed. Then his eyes slowed. His brow creased. The air grew still. He reached page 3. I watched his jaw tighten. "That clause wasn't in the summary Harold showed me," he said. Langford adjusted his glasses. "Your father didn't show you the full document." As per his instructions, only the trust protector had access to the sealed annex. Until today. Miles stared at the page again. Clause 4 and C. "The trustee shall maintain access to the trust's assets only under the condition of respectful, ongoing care toward the named income beneficiary, Clara Evelyn Whitmore. Any abuse, neglect, or financial manipulation shall be grounds for immediate removal." His lips parted, but no words came out. Langford leaned back. "Mr. Whitmore, have you, honestly, read the full will?" The question lingered. Miles's hands began to tremble. "Miles," I said, quietly but clearly, "you didn't lose $85 million today." He looked up, eyes stormy. I continued, "You just burned the last bridge that connected you to trust. Not the financial kind, the kind that matters. You lost your mother's trust." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The arrogance was gone. What replaced it was something far more vulnerable, realization. "You're making a mistake," he whispered. "You'll regret this." "No," I said, standing slowly. "I regret not doing it sooner. I regret raising a son who mistook silence for weakness and inheritance." For entitlement, Langford didn't flinch. He handed a copy of the executed order to Miles. "As of this morning, the Colton Trust Bank has assumed all fiduciary authority. You no longer have control over the trust assets." "Wait," Miles said, voice cracking. "I didn't. No one told me." Langford cut in, calm and final. "It was your responsibility to understand. The law does not reward ignorance." Miles stared at the papers like they were written in a language he didn't know. I walked past him, my heels quiet against the hardwood floor. Before I reached the door, I stopped and said, without turning back, "You didn't read the fine print, Miles. But you wrote your ending loud and clear." And then I left. The voicemail came in at 6:17 a.m. Miles's voice cracked as he spoke. "Mom, I think we need to talk." "Just you and me. Please don't bring Langford. I didn't expect any of this." I didn't respond right away. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, letting the message play again. The morning light crept through the blinds, slicing my worn blanket into stripes of gray and gold. I'd been living out of this small room for 2 weeks now. A kettle, a nightstand, a Bible missing its cover, not much else. And yet, peace. By noon, Ava called. She didn't leave a voicemail. She didn't have to. At 2:04 p.m., I answered on the third ring. Her voice cut straight through the line. "I hope you're happy." I didn't reply. "You've humiliated this family. You've made a mockery of your own son. The bank sent a letter this morning. Everything is frozen. He can't even access the family office funds. What exactly are you trying to prove?" I let her speak. "I've seen selfish women, Clara," Ava snapped. "But what you're doing? This is destruction. You're tearing down your husband's legacy." "His name, my husband," I said calmly, "left instructions. I only followed them." She scoffed. "You used his death to snatch back control." "No," I said, eyes fixed on the small framed photo of Harold beside the motel lamp. "I used his death to remember who I am." A pause. And then she spat. "You're a bitter old woman who can't accept that the world moves on without her." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Click. The line went dead. That evening, Langford emailed me a digital copy of the official notice from Colton Trust Bank. It was dry, as legal documents always are, but I read it twice anyway. Every word felt like a steady breath returning to my lungs. Effective immediately, all trustee signing authority under the Whitmore Living Trust has been suspended for Miles H. Whitmore. The fiduciary oversight has been reassigned to Colton Trust Bank, pursuant to Clause 7.1 of the trust instrument. No disbursements, investments, or contractual obligations may be executed by the former trustee. This freeze is non-negotiable and remains in effect pending. Review it was done. For the first time since Harold passed, the storm inside me began to settle. And yet, I couldn't help but think of the look on Miles's face as he read the clause in Langford's office, his hands trembling, his voice thinning. The boy, who once brought me hand-picked dandelions in a chipped mug, reduced to a man who couldn't recognize his own reflection in the glass of a signed trust. That night, he texted me again. "I didn't mean to push you out." I just thought that's what Dad would have wanted. I stared at that message for a long time. He thought. But he didn't read, didn't listen, didn't respect, didn't pause long enough to ask what I might have needed in that moment of grief. And that was the truth, wasn't it? Miles never tried to understand. He assumed power was his birthright. That age meant obsolescence, that motherhood ends when the inheritance begins. I typed, then deleted, then finally sent one line back. You took the house and the $85 million. But I kept the one thing you didn't understand, integrity. The bubble showed he was typing. Then it disappeared. I put the phone down, folded the bank notice into a small envelope and tucked it inside my purse, just in case. Just in case he tried to twist the story, as he always did. People like Miles measure everything in dollars, in cars, in equity, in legacy dinners. But there are things money can't count. Like how many nights a mother lies awake wondering where she went wrong, or how it feels when your own child looks at you and sees a burden instead of a blessing. The bank had frozen the funds, but what had he lost? More than access. He had lost witnesses to his character, and that doesn't unfreeze. It was almost amusing how quickly the storm changed its tone. 3 days after the bank froze the trust, Ava called again, this time not to scold or insult, but to negotiate. The number showed up as private, but I recognized her clipped breathing the second I picked up. "Clara," she said, syrupy sweet, "I hope you're doing okay. I know things have been tense lately." I didn't reply. I wanted to reach out personally, woman to woman, to put all this behind us. Miles and I have been thinking, and we realize this whole situation has gotten unnecessarily complicated. Unnecessarily complicated. That's what she called it. Stripping a widow of her home, freezing her out of the family she built, twisting a husband's final wishes. Complicated. And? I asked, folding a napkin slowly in my hand, just to feel the texture between my fingers. It helped me stay grounded. "We'd like to propose a resolution," she continued. "Miles spoke to our advisors. We think we can offer you $5 million if you agree to reverse the trustee change." Quietly, of course. No drama, no headlines, I blinked. $5 million. To walk away. To pretend the degradation hadn't happened. To hand back control to a man who told me I was a burden the day after I buried his father. $5 million, I said slowly, letting the number settle in the space between us. "Is that what you think my dignity costs?" There was a brief pause. "I think it's a generous offer, considering the situation," she said. "You wouldn't even have to come back into the house. It's just procedural," that word again. Just procedural. Just a signature. Just silence. I stood up and looked at myself in the motel mirror, my gray blouse, the one with the loose stitching at the sleeve, my wedding ring still there. My eyes, tired, but not defeated. "Ava," I said quietly, "do you know how many nights I sat by Harold's side when he couldn't remember my name, when his hands trembled too much to hold a spoon?" She didn't answer. "Do you know who arranged his medications, paid his hospice care, brushed his hair when it thinned, helped him pray when he forgot the words?" Nothing but silence. It was me. Not Miles. Not his assistants. Not you. Me? Her tone hardened. "This isn't about emotions, Clara. This is about protecting the legacy." "The legacy is already protected," I interrupted, my voice steady. "It's in the trust. It's in the clauses your husband didn't bother to read, and the clause you didn't think I'd ever invoke." She exhaled sharply. "Don't do this. We're giving you a chance to come out of this with grace." I almost laughed. "With grace?" I echoed. "You think buying silence is grace?" "I think dragging the family through legal mud is unnecessary. And I think your version of family only works when everyone stays quiet and obedient." She dropped the civility. "You're a lonely old woman, Clara. You want control because you have nothing else." I didn't flinch. "Wrong," I said. I have one thing. Something none of your money can touch. She waited. My self-respect. That's what I kept when my marriage felt like performance art. That's what I held on to when Miles grew up and saw me as a staff member instead of a mother. That's what I chose when I signed that trustee removal, because I finally remembered I mattered. She didn't respond. I could hear her breath, short and furious, on the other end. I don't want your money, Ava. Keep it. Use it to repaint the guest house. Hire another designer. Build another patio no one will sit on. Click. She ended the call. I stared at the phone for a moment. My hand wasn't shaking. In the silence that followed, I looked back down at the napkin I had folded and unfolded so many times during the call. It was torn at the crease now. Paper can only take so much pressure before it splits. So can people. But I didn't split, and this time I wouldn't fold. I waited until midnight. Something about the stillness of motel nights makes you hear your breath clearer. It's when the humming of vending machines and the flickering of neon signs become your only witnesses. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the small velvet pouch Harold had insisted I keep in the safe deposit box. His handwriting was on the label. For Clara, only when you feel the world has forgotten who you are. That night, I believed it had. It had been weeks since Miles told me to get lost, since I was called a burden in my own home, since the people I loved most treated me like a ghost with a pension. I opened the pouch. Inside was a simple envelope and the silver locket I wore on our honeymoon. I hadn't seen that locket in over 30 years. I held it for a moment, letting the memory of that summer in Nova Scotia wash over me. It still smelled faintly of lavender. But it was the letter I needed. Harold had never been dramatic. He was a man of clean words and clean lines, an engineer through and through. But his heart? That was the one place where he didn't measure or restrain. I unfolded the letter, hands trembling not with fear, but something closer to reverence. And I read, "My Clara. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to look you in the eyes and remind you what you're made of. So let me do it now, the only way I can. You were never just my wife. You were the spine of this family, the breath behind every plan I ever dared to make. I saw the way Miles started treating you, like you were ornamental, and I hated myself for being too weak to correct it while I still had a voice. That's why I made the trust the way I did. That's why I buried this letter behind a layer of legal noise. Because I knew one day you'd need something more powerful than a reminder. If they've pushed you aside, Clara, don't bend. Don't apologize for still being alive, for still deserving. If you're standing alone, stand tall. If you're scared, act anyway. You don't need permission to reclaim your place. You were never a burden. You are the door." And the door was never closed. With all I have left, Harold. I had read only halfway when the tears came, slow at first, then sudden, like summer rain that forgets it's only supposed to drizzle. But it wasn't grief that broke me open. It was recognition. Because somewhere along the way, I had forgotten who I was outside of being a wife, a mother, a woman in waiting. I had forgotten that I once had dreams of becoming a landscape painter, that I used to ride my bike alone through Pinewood Hill just to feel the wind tug at my thoughts, that I loved jazz, that I had opinions. I forgot that I was enough before anyone ever called me theirs. And Harold hadn't forgotten. He remembered it all. Even when his body failed, even when his memory crumbled, he found a way to leave me not just money, not just property, but a mirror to see myself again. I pressed the letter to my chest and finally allowed the sob to escape, not from pain, but from clarity, from being seen. And for the first time in a long time, I spoke aloud in that dimly lit room, half lit by the buzz of a lamp older than my grandchildren. "I'm still here, Harold." The motel air felt less heavy. The loneliness didn't feel like exile anymore. It felt like pause. The next morning, I would return to Langford's office. We had documents to file. But more than that, we had a woman to reintroduce to the world, me. My signature looked different now. It wasn't just ink anymore. It was a declaration. I sat inside a modest office space just 3 blocks from the library, sunlight warming the pages in front of me. The room still smelled faintly of fresh paint and pinewood shelves, but there was a quiet dignity in the air, like something important had just begun. On the letterhead, it read, Whitmore Foundation for the Protection of Elder Financial Dignity. It had taken weeks of work, long conversations with Attorney Langford, outreach to local nonprofits, consultations with a retired judge, and my own research late at night, hunched over a borrowed laptop at the public library. But this morning, it was real. I had just signed the founding charter, approved the trust account, and authorized the first $2 million in seed funding. The money came directly from my share of the Whitmore Family Living Trust. Mine by law, and now finally, mine by intention. The mission was simple, but personal. To protect older adults, especially widows, retirees, and those quietly marginalized, from financial exploitation by their own family members or caretakers. Because what happened to me wasn't rare. It was just rarely talked about. And that was going to change. At first, Langford had gently questioned me. Clara, are you sure you want to pour this much into it so soon? Yes, I told him, because it's not pouring, it's planting. And that's exactly how it felt. We launched the foundation quietly. No press release, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a few emails sent to community centers, nursing homes, and social service departments. We offered free legal clinics for seniors, basic estate planning workshops, and a hotline staffed by trained volunteers, many of whom were retired professionals themselves. Within 3 days, we had over 40 messages. One woman wrote, "My daughter emptied my account to pay for her boyfriend's music studio. I didn't even know how to check the balance online." Another, "My nephew said I was losing my memory, then filed for power of attorney without my consent." Each story was a bruise in a different place, but the pattern was the same. And so the work began. I hired a team of 4, retired accountant, social worker, legal aid, and a young woman named Danny who had once interned for the state attorney's elder care division. They didn't treat me like a symbol. They treated me like a founder. In the first month, we prevented 3 illegal evictions, froze a bank account, under investigation, and helped a woman in her 70s reclaim guardianship over her own affairs. But the shift that surprised me most wasn't in paperwork. It was in how people started to look at me in town. At the grocery store, a clerk who used to glance past me now said, "Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for what you're doing." A young man stopped me outside the post office. "Are you the lady with the foundation?" "My grandma said you helped her friend stay in her home. She said you're like justice with pearls." That made me laugh. I hadn't worn pearls since Harold's retirement dinner, but I appreciated the sentiment. Even the local paper ran a feature story. From exiled mother to advocate, Clara Whitmore's mission to defend dignity. It was a quiet article. No sensationalism, no dramatics. Just truth. I wasn't trying to become famous. I was just trying to make sense of everything that had fallen apart and turn it into something that held. One morning, while watering the modest planter boxes outside our office, I saw a woman hesitate at the door. She looked about my age, gray hair tucked behind her ears, a large handbag clutched like armor. I opened the door gently. "You're safe here," I said. She nodded, stepped in, and whispered, "I saw what happened to you. I think it's happening to me too." That's when I realized this wasn't just about reclaiming power. It was about creating a space where others could reclaim theirs without shame. At night, I still felt the ache. I missed Harold's warm silence beside me. I missed hearing Miles call me Mom without the weight of resentment. but every time I picked up a call from someone afraid to speak their truth or watched one of our volunteers walk an elder through their first bank statement, I felt something return, purpose, and with it, a steady kind of peace. I didn't need revenge. What I needed, what so many of us needed, was recognition, protection, and the right to say no without fear. The Whitmore Foundation wasn't just about preventing abuse. It was about planting dignity back where it had been quietly stolen, and I was just getting started. It was Langford who brought it up, cautiously, as if the suggestion might shatter something fragile. "There's a provision in the trust," he said, adjusting his glasses. "A pathway clause. Your late husband," he included a rehabilitative measure for beneficiaries who violate the moral conduct clause. I nodded, waiting. Langford continued. "The trustee bank, Colton, reviewed Miles's behavior and agreed. If he can demonstrate ethical and meaningful engagement for 12 consecutive months, they'll consider reevaluating his limited beneficiary access. On probation, of course. No control, just access to basic financial support." I didn't speak right away. I stared at the papers on the desk. Probation, redemption, a second chance. Miles hadn't asked for this, not directly. He was still processing the reality that his authority had been stripped. His bank cards were inactive. The family home now under legal trust review. The silence between us, thick and stubborn, had not been bridged. But maybe Harold had known something I hadn't yet admitted, that our son wasn't born cruel. He had just lost his way. And sometimes the right path back wasn't paved in money. It was paved in service. "I'll agree," I finally said, "but only under one condition." Langford waited. Every Friday for the next 12 months, Miles works at the Whitmore Center. No exceptions, no excuses. One full day of service, not behind a desk, among people. Real people. Langford raised a brow. "He might resist that." I looked up. "Then he's not ready." The proposal reached Miles through formal notice, but he called me directly. His voice cracked halfway through. "You're serious?" "Very." He sighed, long and low. "You want me to scrub floors and hand out flyers?" "I want you to listen to the people you thought you were better than. I want you to see what financial abuse looks like outside a boardroom, and I want you to show up when it's inconvenient. Every Friday, rain or shine, silence." Then a quiet answer I hadn't expected. "Okay." His first Friday, he arrived late. Pressed shirt but no tie. Sneakers. He looked out of place, awkward even, standing in the community kitchen with Danny, our youngest staff member. I watched from the hallway as he hesitated, then put on gloves and began sorting canned goods. He didn't talk much that day, but he didn't complain either. At lunch, I passed him a tray and nodded toward the round table where some of our senior clients were playing bingo. "You might want to sit in," I said. "They don't bite." He didn't sit, but he stood nearby and smiled when a woman won her 4th game in a row and declared, "I'm luckier than my 3 ex-husbands combined." Small steps. Week 2, he arrived on time. Week 3, he stayed late. Week 5, he led a basic budgeting session for a group of retired janitors who didn't know what compounding interest meant. He explained it clearly, patiently, without arrogance. By week 8, one of the women from our financial recovery group asked me quietly, "Is that your son?" I nodded. She gave me a soft smile. He's learning how to talk like people again. Every week, Miles signed in. The foundation logged his hours, tracked his engagement, and filed monthly reports with the trustee bank. There were no shortcuts, no days off, no pretense. One Friday in December, he found me sitting in my office, reviewing a letter from a woman in Tennessee who said the foundation saved her from eviction. He knocked on the frame. "Can I come in?" I gestured toward the chair. "Of course." He sat, then leaned forward. "I still don't understand why Dad gave you the right to remove me." I do, but it hurts. I nodded slowly. It was never about hurting you, Miles. It was about honoring the trust we both broke. His brow furrowed. You? I looked at him, tired but honest. I should have stepped in sooner. I let silence become a wall between us. I let your father do the protecting while I stayed in the background. I thought I was preserving peace, but I was just avoiding truth. He swallowed. So what now? I held up the latest report from the bank. You're halfway through? 6 months left. And then they'll reevaluate your access. But that's not what matters most. He blinked. What does? I smiled faintly. Whether you'd keep coming even if there wasn't money at the end of it. Sometimes redemption doesn't roar. It shows up on Fridays, quiet, willing, learning. It stacks canned goods, teaches budgeting, carries bags for elders, and sometimes it apologizes, not in words but in presence. Miles hadn't become a new man overnight. He was still Miles, but maybe, just maybe, he was becoming the man Harold had hoped he'd grow into. And I was no longer the burden he cast out. I was the mother who finally learned the power of boundaries, loving ones. Fridays became my anchor. They arrived with the scent of brewed coffee, the shuffle of walkers against the linoleum floors, and the low hum of conversation between strangers who had learned to become each other's family. And every Friday at exactly 8:54 a.m., Miles walked through the front doors of the Whitmore Center. No one clapped. No one cared who his parents were or what he used to drive. They just handed him gloves, a clipboard, or a mop, depending on the schedule. At first, he was mechanical, his smile forced, his words measured. I watched from a distance, saying little. Sometimes I'd pass him in the hallway and nod. Nothing more. He took longer to warm up to the residents. He preferred stocking supplies over starting conversations. And if he lingered at the exit 5 minutes early, I let it go. Redemption didn't come with a stopwatch. But something shifted by week 9. He stayed to help a retired school teacher fold brochures, asked the receptionist if anyone needed a ride home, sat in silence next to a stroke survivor while she pieced together a puzzle with one hand. And when one of the volunteers didn't show, he rolled up his sleeves and served lunch. No complaints, no eye rolls. Just presence. I began to see flashes of the boy I raised, the one who used to collect canned goods for food drives, the one who cried when his childhood dog passed. He'd been buried somewhere beneath ambition and arrogance. Now he was learning to breathe again. One Friday, I walked into the multi-purpose room and found Miles seated beside a man in a wheelchair. The man was older, grizzled, with one leg missing below the knee and hands that trembled slightly as he held a styrofoam cup. I kept my distance, but I heard the man's voice cut through the air like sandpaper. My boy sold my house and said it was for my own good, he muttered, told me I was safer in a facility. Miles didn't respond right away. The man chuckled bitterly. You know what's funny? He never came back. Not once. Dropped me off like a bad habit. Still, no response. Then the man turned toward him and added, At least you came back. I saw Miles freeze. The cup in his hand trembled. But he said nothing. After a long pause, he gently reached forward and adjusted the man's blanket. And that was enough. Later that day, I found Miles in the kitchen, scrubbing trays with more force than necessary. I stepped beside him, drying with a towel. He remind you of someone? I asked softly. Miles didn't look at me. Yes, he said finally. Me. Water kept running. I thought I was better than all this, he murmured. Too important. Too busy. I thought I could measure worth in square footage and trust balances. I handed him a dry towel. And now? He paused. Now, I'm not sure what I am, but I know I've got work to do. I looked at him. You're doing it, I said simply. He began arriving early. He stopped checking his phone. He learned names. He remembered stories. He helped Mister. Gonzalez fixed the broken latch on his walker, sat through group therapy with widowed veterans, helped Mrs. Patel FaceTime her daughter in Florida. One afternoon, I overheard him say, "No, ma'am, I'm just staff here." He didn't even mention me. That evening, I sat on the front bench and watched him walk toward the parking lot, his coat slung over one shoulder. He looked tired, but not drained, rooted. He turned once, caught my eye, and gave a quiet nod before disappearing into the twilight. I held on to that image like scripture, because it reminded me regret was only the beginning. Responsibility. That was where the healing lived. I walked past the storage wing on a quiet Thursday afternoon and saw the door ajar. Inside, a soft shaft of light filtered through the high window, catching the dust dancing in the air. It was oddly peaceful, like the kind of stillness that follows a storm. Not silence, but the hush that comes with healing. There, crouched beside a shelf of medical records and extra linens, was Miles. His sleeves were rolled up, and he was quietly reinforcing the lower panel of a wobbly bookshelf. A small hammer rested beside him, and he was aligning each screw by hand, slowly, carefully, as though the integrity of the shelf mattered more than anyone would guess. I didn't interrupt. I simply watched. He moved with the kind of focus I hadn't seen in years. Not rushed, not performative, just present. Each shelf he secured seemed to restore a small part of him. And when he stood, he wiped his hands, straightened the labels on a box of adult diapers, and repositioned a folded blanket on top of the cart. None of this was required. No one had asked him. But he did it anyway, because I realized this wasn't penance anymore. It was pride. That evening, I received a call from a friend who worked at the courthouse. Nothing confidential, just a quiet tip. Ava had filed for divorce. No media coverage, no gossip column. Just a sealed petition and a signature filed late in the day. And suddenly, everything made sense. The clipped tone in Ava's last email, the solitary arrival of Miles every Friday. No more joint appearances, no check-ins, no shared glances. They had unraveled, and it hadn't taken millions to do it. It had taken something far simpler, the absence of pretense. When I arrived at the center the next morning, Miles was already in the parking lot unloading a box of donated books. He greeted me with a soft, "Morning," then turned back to work. I considered pretending I didn't know, but I'd learned something too. Silence may protect pride, but truth preserves dignity. So I walked up beside him and said gently, "I heard about Ava." He didn't flinch. He placed a book onto the cart. "Yeah, she moved out last weekend, took the espresso machine." I didn't smile, not even inwardly. This wasn't a moment to feel vindicated. "You okay?" I asked. He paused, then nodded. "I think so." A beat of quiet passed between us. Then I added, "I'm not happy that you're hurting, Miles." He looked up. "I'm just relieved that you're finally awake." His expression shifted, not shame, not anger, just stillness. "Thanks, Mom," he said quietly. "That means more than I expected." Later that day, he spent 2 hours sorting through the old recreation room. He lined up chessboards, tested every lamp, and even used a soft cloth to clean the brass nameplates on the donor wall. I found him sitting alone when the sun started to fall, staring at one of the plaques. I sat beside him without speaking. He finally broke the silence. "She always said people only respect power, that you have to win before you can be loved." "Ava?" I asked. He nodded. "But love that's bought," he said, "never really stays." I said nothing. He turned to me. "Did you know I used to believe her?" "I know," I said. He exhaled. "I'm sorry I did." I placed a hand on his. "Believing a lie doesn't make you weak, Miles. But staying in it, that's what breaks people." He looked away, blinking fast. "I thought I needed her." I shook my head. "You needed someone to tell you that who you are without wealth or title is still enough." He turned back to me. "And you think I am?" I smiled. Not the kind that flashes, but the kind that lingers. I think you're becoming. That night, I sat in my room with the lamp on low, rereading a passage from Harold's old journals. He once wrote, "The measure of a man is how he stands when the ladder is gone and no one is watching." For years, I thought Harold meant himself. Now I think he meant our son. And as the light flickered and the words blurred just slightly on the page, I let myself believe, for the first time in a long time, that maybe the end of something isn't always loss. Sometimes it's the clearing we never had the courage to make for something new to grow. The room still smelled like him. Harold's study had always been a sacred place in the house. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather-bound journals, maps, old law texts, even the scent of cedar and worn paper. It felt like stepping into the mind of a man who never stopped thinking. For weeks after the funeral, I kept the door shut. I couldn't bring myself to disturb it, as if even the dust belonged to his memory. But now, I stood there with the key in my hand, not to mourn, but to begin again. It was time. The world I had clung to, marriage, motherhood, obedience, compromise, had already broken. And somehow, in its fragments, I found something I hadn't seen in years: space. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and opened the curtains wide. Sunlight poured in. It wasn't gentle. It was unapologetic, bold, like it had waited too long outside. The study looked smaller in daylight, and quieter. I walked to his desk and ran my fingers across the worn edge. Then gently, I began to clear it. Each item had a place in his world, but I was no longer a keeper of Harold's legacy. I was a woman carving out her own. The law books went into sealed boxes for donation, the framed certificates into storage. A rusted globe, once a favorite of his, I tucked away with care. It didn't feel like erasing. It felt like pruning, making room for something new to bloom. By evening, the space was bare, except for a single wooden easel I brought down from the attic. I hadn't painted in over 30 years, not since art school, not since I gave up exhibitions to help Harold through law school, not since I exchanged acrylics and oil pastels for grocery lists, parent-teacher conferences, and quiet endurance. But that night, under a bare bulb, I picked up a brush. The first strokes were awkward. My hand trembled, not from age, but from memory. The canvas stared back at me like an old friend I had ghosted without explanation. But then something shifted. I didn't sketch outlines. I didn't measure dimensions. I let the colors come first. Deep indigos, burnt siennas, soft ochres. And then, slowly, the shape of a woman began to take form. Not a perfect figure, not youthful, not symmetrical, but real. A woman, midlife, standing at a tall window, one hand resting on the pane, the other not visible. Her shoulders were relaxed, not defeated. Her face, unfinished. The light from outside poured in over her shoulder, casting long shadows across her chest. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to be. For the first time, I wasn't painting to meet expectations. I was painting to see myself. Each night after that, I returned to the canvas. Layer by layer, I added nuance to her silhouette. Lines under the eyes that told stories. Soft creases around the mouth that hinted at resilience. The light from the window grew warmer with every brushstroke, not because I intended it, but because my hands knew what my mind hadn't caught up to yet. This woman wasn't waiting for someone to rescue her. She wasn't watching the horizon for someone else to return. She was the light. She stood in it, owned it, reflected it. By the 6th evening, the painting was done. I stepped back and looked at her, at me. I hadn't written a single title on a canvas in decades, but the words came without hesitation. No one else holds the brush. That's what I wrote in tiny script in the corner, because it was true. Not Miles, not Harold, not Ava, not any lawyer, not society, not even the years that had passed with silence. This life was mine now, and the only hands that would color it forward were mine. I hung the portrait across from the window where I'd first painted her, so that the morning light would strike her face directly. It changed the entire energy of the room. Neighbors started stopping by, dropping off old sketch pads or unused tubes of paint. Someone from the community center offered to feature the portrait at their gallery for seniors. I declined, not because I wasn't proud, but because the art wasn't for the public. It was for the girl I had left behind and the woman I had become. One morning, as I was tidying the brushes, Miles stepped into the room. He had never entered the study since Harold passed. He paused in the doorway like he wasn't sure he was allowed. I nodded toward the canvas. He walked closer and stared at the self-portrait. He didn't say anything at first. Then, after a long pause, he whispered, "She looks strong." I met his eyes. "She is." Another silence. "I never saw you like this," he admitted. "You never needed to," I said, "but I always was." He nodded slowly, then left the room, and I smiled, not because I had proved anything, but because I no longer needed to. 12 months can change everything or nothing. I walked into the Langford conference room with a steady heart. The windows overlooked the square, where leaves had just begun to curl at their edges, hinting at the fall. The same season Harold left me. The same season Miles tried to erase me. But seasons don't erase. They reveal. Mr. Langford was already seated at the head of the table, folders organized in precise stacks. 2 representatives from Colton Trust Bank nodded as I entered. A seat was reserved at the far end for Miss Bloom, the quiet observer who had watched it all unfold without ever raising her voice. Until now. Miles was not in the room yet. I placed a small envelope on the table beside me. Inside were 2 photographs, neither framed, just prints, unassuming and blunt, like truth itself. Langford tapped the table. Gently, "Shall we begin?" The trustee from Colton adjusted his tie. Yes, today marks exactly 1 year since Mrs. Whitmore exercised her legal right to remove the original trustee and appoint the Colton Bank as interim manager of the Whitmore Living Trust. As per Clause 8D, we are here to review the 12-month ethics evaluation to determine whether limited beneficiary rights may be reinstated. There was a pause before Langford added, "With Mrs. Whitmore's approval, of course, I nodded but said nothing. This was not a performance. This was a reckoning." Just then, the door opened and Miles walked in. He looked tired. Thinner, perhaps. Less polished than the last time I'd seen him in a suit, but he was no longer wearing defense-like armor. There was something rawer now, and real. He took his seat across the table from me, but didn't meet my eyes. Langford cleared his throat. "Miss Bloom, if you would begin." The social worker straightened her papers and stood. Her voice, as always, was calm, but what she said held weight. "Over the course of 12 months, Mr. Miles Whitmore has fulfilled his volunteer obligations every Friday at the Whitmore Community Center. Tasks included facility maintenance, senior companionship, coordination with care volunteers, and program assistance." She paused, then looked directly at the board. "He was late once." When his wife filed for divorce, a brief silence settled. Even Miles flinched a little. Bloom continued. "He has responded respectfully to all staff. Seniors have noted his kindness, especially after the 3rd month. One resident in hospice named him as their bright spot. Miles has not asked to terminate or reduce hours. He has not inquired once about reinstatement. In my opinion, this marks behavioral reform rooted in action rather than entitlement." She sat back down. Langford raised an eyebrow. "Thank you, Miss Bloom." Then he turned to the trustees. "Based on this report and our internal audits, we at Langford and Company recommend that limited beneficiary rights, excluding voting rights or financial control, be considered for reinstatement. These would include access to annual interest income capped at a threshold, subject to behavior clauses moving forward. Everyone turned to me. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached for the envelope and took out the 2 photographs. I placed them side by side in front of me. One was a dimly lit image of the motel I had fled to a year ago. The neon sign was barely working, the curtains drawn shut. You could feel the silence just looking at it. The other was a candid photo of Miles inside the community center's back room. He was bent over, organizing donated books. A crooked shelf leaned beside him. His sleeves were rolled, sweat on his brow. He looked human. Not entitled, not cruel, just a man, rebuilding with his hands. I stood slowly. "I want to tell you what these photos mean," I said, my voice clear. "This," I pointed to the first image, "was where I ended up after my husband's funeral. I didn't choose it out of drama. I chose it because my son, who inherited the house and $85 million, told me I was a burden, that there was no place for me anymore." Everyone stayed quiet. I turned to the second image. "And this," I said, "is where I found the son I once knew. Not in the mansion, not in the marble kitchen where Ava planned renovations while I packed my life into 2 boxes, but here, in the back room of a community center where he worked quietly beside people who had nothing to offer him but their names and their stories." I exhaled. "I do believe in second chances," I said, "but not without consequence." I looked directly at Miles. "I choose what Harold wanted. Opportunity with conditions." Langford leaned forward. "Meaning?" I turned to the trustees. "I approve reinstatement of a fixed, modest distribution. Not because Miles asked, but because he didn't. Not because he apologized, but because he showed up. I paused, letting that land. However, full beneficiary status is permanently off the table unless further review is warranted after 3 years of consistent civic service. And I will not be reversing my designation of Colton Bank as trustee. No one objected." Langford gave a slow nod. "Very well. Shall we record this formally?" I nodded again. The paperwork would be signed by noon. Miles still hadn't spoken. He stood once everyone rose and quietly walked to my side of the table. "I didn't deserve your trust," he said softly. "I may never. But thank you for this." I looked at him, not as a mother wounded, but as a woman watching someone remember how to be whole. "You didn't earn it with words," I said. "Don't lose it with silence." He nodded. "I won't." As I walked out of the boardroom, I folded the 2 photos together and slipped them back into the envelope. They weren't memories, they were mile markers of where we began again, not perfectly, but truthfully. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the wind sounds like someone whispering through the trees, but not saying anything you can quite understand. Miles stood in the doorway of my porch, not entering until I nodded. He had changed. The self-importance was gone. The designer shoes were replaced by worn leather ones, and his shirt sleeves were rolled like someone who expected to get his hands dirty. He didn't sit right away, just held something in his hands, a ceramic mug from the center. A volunteer had made it, probably crooked and glazed in too many colors, but he held it carefully, like it meant something. Then, without preamble, he asked, "Do you forgive me, Mom?" I looked at him. It wasn't the kind of look you give your child, not anymore. It was the kind of look you give a man who once held power over you and now stands on his own feet asking to be seen for who he's become, not who he was. I folded my hands in my lap. "Forgiveness," I said slowly, "is a gift." He didn't speak. He waited. "I don't give out gifts to people who haven't learned what they cost," I continued. "And truthfully, Miles, I think you're still figuring it out." He lowered his eyes. "I see your effort," I added, softening my tone. "I see the hours, the way you show up, the care. But you don't need my forgiveness." His head lifted slightly. You need to learn how to live with what you did. That's called responsibility silence passed between us. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't warm either. It was honest. I never meant to, he began. I know, I cut in gently, and that's the part that frightens me most. That you didn't even realize it until everything started to fall. He swallowed hard. You didn't push me out because you hated me. You did it because you didn't see me, I said. And that blindness is what broke us. He leaned back, his hands tight around the mug. I wanted to believe I was doing the right thing, he murmured. That Dad meant for me to lead. To take over, to be in control. I smiled faintly. He never wanted you to control anything. He wanted you to understand what stewardship meant, but you skipped that part. He nodded. I still hear his voice, you know, I added, in the garden, in the letters. Sometimes in my own silence. And what I hear isn't forgiveness, it's clarity. Miles looked up, this time directly at me. So what now? He asked. I stood slowly and walked to the shelf where I'd kept Harold's final amendment to the trust, an envelope marked with both our names. I brought it over and placed it between us. I've authorized a partial restoration of your beneficiary rights, I said. Limited distributions monthly, no access to principal. Everything filtered and managed through Colton's third-party oversight. His breath caught slightly. You did? I did. Because I believe you're learning. But don't confuse this with reward. It's not a medal. It's a test. He nodded, taking that in without argument. You'll continue your Fridays at the center. And in 6 months, the board will review your engagement. Not just attendance, but presence. They'll ask the seniors about you. They'll ask the staff. If it's just for the check, we'll all know. He nodded again. Then, his voice barely audible. I wish I could undo what I said to you that day. I looked at him. This version of him, both broken and remade. You can undo it, I said, but you can outgrow it. He exhaled and looked away. We sat in silence for a few minutes. A bird sang from the fence. A lawnmower hummed in the distance. Life didn't pause for mother and son to recalibrate, and that, perhaps, was the most grounding truth of all. Eventually, he stood. I'll see you Friday, he said. I nodded. He walked back down the porch steps, his frame no longer towering with pride, but held up by something steadier, accountability. As the door clicked shut behind him, I realized something. I hadn't said, I forgive you. I hadn't needed to, because what I'd given him was harder than that. I'd given him a mirror and then stepped back to see if he could bear to keep looking, and maybe that was the most merciful thing I could do. It was nearing dusk when the call came, the kind of light that turns the curtains gold and makes you forget for a moment what season it is. I had just finished rinsing the teacup I used every afternoon, bone china with tiny roses faded from decades of use, when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something in my chest told me before I even picked up. Clara, the voice said, flat, controlled, practiced. It's Ava. I didn't answer right away. My hand rested on the kitchen counter, cool under my palm. She went on. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened, for everything. And I was wondering, she hesitated. I was wondering if you might consider helping us rebuild the family name. There's been press, gossip. Some community partners are pulling out of Miles's old projects. It's not good, Clara. It reflects badly on all of us. There it was. Not a plea. Not a confession. A proposal. I sat down at the small dining table, folded my free hand over my knee, and looked out the window. The wind was nudging the bird feeder, scattering seeds across the porch. Ava, I said calmly, you're not the last person I want to hear from. But I'll be honest, I never expected you to call at all. She let out a breath, somewhere between relief and tension. I wasn't sure I should. You shouldn't, if what you're asking for is image repair, I said. But if you're asking for dinner, you're welcome. My doors opened Thursday night. There was a pause. Dinner? Yes, I'm making shepherd's pie and lemon tarts. I have a bottle of wine from Harold's old shelf I've been saving. Oh, okay. That's generous. One condition, I added. Her silence told me she expected it. No talk of money. No talk of trust funds or public image or Miles's inheritance or what the community thinks. Just two women sharing a meal. If you're willing to do that, you're welcome. She hesitated. Can I think about it? She asked. Of course. I didn't expect her to call back. That night, I set the table for two anyway. Out of hope, number, out of discipline. The kind that says, do your part, even if the world doesn't meet you halfway. I chopped the onions with care, laid out cloth napkins, lit a single candle. The food was warm by 7. By 8, it had cooled. I didn't reheat it. At 9, I packed it away in glass, containers, and slid them into the fridge. She never came. And strangely, I didn't feel disappointed, because this wasn't about closure or confrontation or even the hope of reconciliation. It was a boundary, a simple, quiet line drawn in the sand. She had wanted access, again, but I offered connection, human, free of transaction, and she couldn't take it. There was power in that understanding. Harold used to say, "Don't judge people by how they fail. Judge them by how they respond when given a second chance." Well, Ava's second chance came wrapped in linen napkins and lemon tarts, and she declined. The next morning, I took the extra plate to the Whitmore Center, gave it to Mr. Hobbs, who always said my crust was better than his late wife's. He laughed and called me dangerous. It was a better end to that meal than I could have imagined. And as for Ava, I think she called because she was afraid of becoming irrelevant. But what she never understood is this: respect isn't inherited, it's cultivated, and you can't demand it back once you've trampled it under your heels. I'd once believed wealth was meant to secure the future of one's family. That's what Harold and I worked so hard for. Early mornings, careful ledgers, investments triple-checked. It took me nearly a lifetime to realize family isn't always the rightful destination of wealth. Sometimes it's just the origin. That morning, I sat across from a banker in a glass-paneled office with a view of the entire valley. The woman, sharp-eyed but kind, nodded as I handed her the folder. "The full amount?" she asked gently, as though confirming something unspoken. "Yes, $5 million, I said, steady and certain. "Allocate $2 million to the Whitmore Educational Scholarship Fund, priority for students from households flagged for financial abuse or instability. The remaining $3 million, I want directed toward our elder justice outreach, housing security, legal aid, emergency grants." She typed something swiftly, then looked up. "Miss?" "Whitmore," she said. "This will help so many. I'm counting on that," I replied. "And please, anonymous disbursement only. I want no press, no naming buildings, no plaques." She smiled. Understood. I left with a lighter step than I'd had in years. Money, it turned out, wasn't power until it moved, until it flowed where it was needed, not just where it was expected. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. No return address. Just a plain envelope slipped into the nonprofit's mailbox. Langford passed it to me with a curious look. I opened it slowly, more from ritual than suspense. It was handwritten in blue ink on a lined page torn from a school notebook. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore, you don't know me, but I know you. I'm one of the first recipients of your new scholarship, but this letter isn't just to say thank you for tuition. It's something more personal. You see, my mother was one of the women your center helped last fall. She was trapped in a situation I don't even like to speak out loud. Financial control, emotional violence, the whole nightmare. One of your volunteers met her at the pharmacy and gave her a card. That card led to an intake meeting, then legal support, then housing. That card saved us. I'm writing this from my dorm room, my first real room in a real place of safety. I made it here not because we were rich, but because you changed the current. Thank you. Leah M. I read it 3 times, each pass a little slower. The letter didn't ask for anything. It didn't flatter. It bore no agenda. It simply witnessed something I had nearly forgotten mattered: impact. I folded the page carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it inside the wooden jewelry box Harold had once carved for me by hand. It was where I now kept things more valuable than gold: notes from volunteers, photos from the Whitmore Center's first anniversary, a dried flower from the memorial we held for Mrs. Gutierrez last winter. Proof that legacy isn't measured by who inherits your fortune, it's by who rises from it. Later that week, I spoke at a small gathering at the community college. Nothing grand, just a few chairs in a library room, a circle of young women curious about public service. They asked me how I knew where to begin. "You won't know," I told them. "That's the truth." You just start where the herd is loudest, and trust that if you listen long enough, the map will draw itself. A girl in the back raised her hand and asked, "Do you ever regret giving away so much money instead of keeping it for your family?" I thought for a moment before answering. "No," I said, because money wasn't what my family needed most. We needed healing, accountability, distance. And that, I touched the pocket where Leah's letter rested. That's what this money has become, a boundary with a heartbeat. They clapped, but it wasn't the applause that moved me. It was the way 2 of them lingered after, asking for copies of the center's volunteer schedule. It felt like oxygen entering a room that had been shut too long. Back home, I looked at the old fireplace mantel, still carved with the initials H and C, a groove Harold had made the winter we moved in. I used to think that was the most permanent thing we built together. Now, I think it's the quiet ripple we set off when we chose people over possessions. A new current had begun, and it was carrying us someplace better. For months, I'd been painting in pieces, strokes without certainty, colors without full confidence. But that morning, the sun reached the corner of the room in a way that made me pause. The east light filtered through the sheer linen curtain, landing on the canvas I had left half covered since February. Dust motes floated like ash in a cathedral. It felt like an invitation. I sat down, exhaled slowly, and uncovered the portrait. It was me. Or rather, a version of me that I wasn't entirely sure existed when I started the painting. The lines were softer than I expected, the gaze firmer. And the woman in the frame, she wasn't grieving. She wasn't angry. She was clear. I dipped the brush in a blend of sienna and peach, just enough to deepen the shadows under the cheekbone, then a hint of soft ochre across the brow to catch the light. I'd always believed eyes were the soul's signature, but in this portrait it was the slight upturn at the corners of the mouth that told the truth. I didn't smile often. I had spent decades curving my mouth just enough to be polite, presentable. But this was a real smile. The kind that doesn't seek approval, the kind that simply is. The last stroke was the hardest, not the skin, not the light in the iris. It was the text. Harold used to tease me that I didn't need to sign my paintings. He said he could recognize one of mine from across the room just by the way it made him feel. But this one needed a sentence, a declaration. I dipped the smallest brush into a deep blue gray, steadying my hand just above the wood at the bottom of the frame. Then, in my clearest hand, I wrote, "I didn't win by fighting. I won by remembering who I was, and when the final letter dried, I sat back and let it look at me. I don't know how long I sat there. Time had no sharp edges in that moment, but eventually I stood up, took 3 steps back, and something clicked. This wasn't just a painting. This was evidence of return, of reclamation, of survival without bitterness. I'd once believed I had to fight for everything, to earn my place, to defend my worth, to prove I mattered in rooms where my silence was expected. But now I knew. My power didn't come from shouting louder. It came from standing still long enough to remember. Remember what mattered. Remember who I had been before the titles: wife, mother, widow, before the betrayal, the trust fund wars, the lawyer meetings, the frostbitten mornings in my own home. I had been Clara Whitmore, a girl who once painted portraits under magnolia trees, a woman who had built a life of devotion, then rebuilt it with boundaries, a mother who had lost her way for a while, but had found the courage to redraw the map. The painting caught all of that, without pretense, without apology. I placed it gently against the wall near the window, right beside Harold's last photograph, a candid shot he'd taken of me in the garden, hair messy, holding a chipped mug of tea. He always said that was his favorite image of me, unposed, unbothered. Now he had two versions of me side by side, the past in film grain and the present in brushstrokes. Later that evening, I invited Bloom over. I didn't tell her why, just asked her to stop by if she had time. When she arrived, I led her into the room and let her see it for herself. She stood quietly for a long while. Look, she started, then stopped. I didn't need her to finish the sentence. Instead, she walked closer and traced the air in front of the words I'd written at the bottom. I didn't win by fighting, she read aloud. I won by remembering who I was. Then she looked at me, and something in her expression changed. Not pity, not pride, just understanding. We didn't speak much after that. She left with a soft nod, and I stood in the doorway until her car disappeared down the road. I returned to the portrait and turned off the overhead light. The evening sun was enough now. It hit the canvas just right, illuminating one half of the face while letting the other fall into gentle shadow. It didn't need perfect symmetry. Life never gave us that. It just needed truth. And I had finally painted mine. That morning, the air felt different. Still, almost reverent. I was halfway through brewing a pot of Earl Grey when I noticed something on the porch, a small box, simple brown paper, no ribbon. At first, I assumed it was a delivery, a neighbor returning something I'd lent, or perhaps Bloom dropping off more brochures for the foundation. But the handwriting on the note taped to the top stopped me. It was Miles. No salutation, just 3 words. For when you're ready. My hands hesitated on the flap before gently opening the box. Inside, cushioned in soft cloth, was an old key. Not just any key. It was Harold's. The brass had dulled over the years, but I recognized the weight, the curved edge, the faint notch just above the teeth. It used to unlock the drawer where Harold kept everything important, his will, letters, small mementos I never asked about. But now, the key looked different. Someone, Miles, I assumed, had taken the time to etch a new word into the metal. Mom. I touched the engraving with my fingertip. It wasn't perfect. The letters weren't even. But they were careful. Honest. Beneath the key was a folded piece of cream stationery. I sat down before reading it. Mom, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. I don't expect things to go back to how they were, but I wanted to return something that never should have been mine to keep. Dad's key was always half yours. You've done more with silence than I ever did with money. I still mess up. I still catch myself looking for shortcuts. But when I see your face now, steady, whole, I remember who I was raised by. I'm not good yet, but I know I need to try. Miles. I don't remember crying. I just remember placing the letter down, key resting atop it, and walking toward the front door like something in me already knew what came next. The threshold felt taller that morning, wider, as if the house itself had expanded in quiet agreement. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, letting the light catch my face, and then I stood at the edge, right where the shadow met the sunlight, and placed my hand on the old wooden frame. It was warm. For a long time, I used to think healing looked like reconciliation, that it required apology, closeness, a return to what had been. But now I knew better. Healing, for me, looked like clarity. It looked like a boundary so firm it didn't need to be spoken aloud. It looked like choosing peace over proximity, growth over guilt, and truth over tradition. That key didn't unlock any door in my home anymore. I'd changed the locks years ago, but I kept it in my hand, turning it slowly, like a talisman from a different life. It wasn't about opening something physical. It was about what it symbolized. A turning point, a willingness, a whisper of effort in a boy who once slammed the door in my face. He hadn't redeemed himself, not yet, but he'd stopped pretending he didn't need to. I stood there a while longer, letting the morning rise around me. I thought of Harold, of the soft way he said my name when no one was listening. I thought of our Sunday afternoons, his laugh when my paint-stained hands left marks on his collar, his voice in the kitchen asking if I wanted lemon or cream in my tea. He would have been proud, not of the drama, the courts, the trust documents, of the stillness in me now, of how I had walked through the storm and emerged, not untouched, but unbroken. Behind me, the house was quiet, but not hollow. The painting in my studio was dry now, resting on its easel like it was waiting for its story to end. But maybe it hadn't ended. Maybe it had just opened. A soft wind curled through the porch and rustled the edges of Miles' letter. I caught it before it drifted and tucked it into my cardigan pocket. Later, I would frame it, not to display, just to remember. Not everything needs to be forgiven to be honored. Sometimes acknowledgement is its own form of love. Before we say goodbye, if you're listening now, I wonder where you're watching from. Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let me know in the comments. I read every one with care. And if this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to this little space we've built together. Not just to hear more stories like mine, but to remind yourself that even in a world that forgets to slow down, healing still happens. Second chances still find a way. Sometimes the miracle doesn't knock. It waits, quietly, until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, wherever you are. And remember, no one can push me anymore because I chose to walk with law, with clarity, and with a heart that no longer agrees to be small.